He promised young men food and money, then buried them in the very soil they worked on. One by one, they entered his farm. None ever left alive. I'm Santa, and tonight I'll take you inside the nightmare of a farmer in his 50s who turned honest work into a death trap. The story begins in a quiet town. For years, missing persons reports piled up. Young men, usually in their 20s, men with no stable job, men who answered ads or spoke to locals about finding seasonal work, simply disappeared. At first, no one connected the dots. People come and go all the time. Some chase opportunities in other towns. Some leave without telling their families. But soon, a disturbing pattern started to emerge. They were all last seen boarding buses, cars, or hitchhiking in the same direction, toward the outskirts, near a farm owned by a man named Richard Holloway. Richard was 54. He lived alone on a sprawling farm that seemed too large for one man to maintain. Locals described him as quiet, polite enough, but strange. He rarely came into town, rarely spoke to neighbors, and when he did, his words were clipped, his eyes cold. For years, nobody asked questions. Farms are private, and Richard kept to himself. But Richard wasn't farming crops. He was cultivating fear. The first time Richard killed, it wasn't planned, at least. That's what he would later claim. A drifter, a 22-year-old looking for money, had been brought to the farm. Richard offered him a place to sleep in the barn and promised a few dollars for chores. Days passed. The young man complained about not being paid. He threatened to leave. Richard panicked. He lured him to the tool shed, struck him from behind with a heavy iron bar, and watched him collapse. The silence afterward was intoxicating. Richard buried him behind the barn. The earth swallowed the secret, and Richard learned something dangerous. Murder made problems disappear. Over the months, Richard grew bolder. He began to deliberately seek out young men at gas stations and diners. He'd pull up in his dusty truck, smile faintly, and offer them cash for simple work, repairing fences, feeding animals, cleaning the land. To someone broke and desperate, it sounded like salvation. They climbed in. They never climbed out. Inside the farm, Richard had a system. He'd feed them, give them a cot in the barn, let them work a few days. Just enough to make them trust him. Then, when night fell, when their guards were down, he struck. Sometimes he drugged their food. Sometimes he used blunt force. Always, he disposed of them the same way, shallow graves scattered across his land. He dug at night, burying them beneath rows of corn, behind sheds, under the shadow of trees. By day, the farm looked ordinary. By night, it became a burial ground. The families of the missing men begged for answers. Flyers went up. Police logged their cases. But with no bodies, no scenes of violence, no obvious connections, there was nothing to chase. For years, Richard's farm remained untouched. But killers leave patterns. Richard's arrogance grew. He began bringing in more men in shorter spans of time. 1 month, 2 disappeared within weeks of each other. Another month, a third. A deputy sheriff noticed the pattern. He gathered files, laid them side by side, and realized something. All of them had mentioned work on a farm. Different names, same destination. Richard Holloway's property was suddenly under a microscope. Detectives visited the farm. Richard greeted them politely, his shirt tucked, his voice calm. He let them walk around. The land stretched wide, barns filled with tools, soil freshly turned. Nothing seemed unusual. They left without a warrant. Richard smiled as they drove off, thinking his secret was safe. But it wasn't. The break came when a young man escaped. His name was Daniel, 19 years old. He had been lured the same way, a promise of $50 for a week's work. Richard gave him a bed in the barn. But on the third night, Daniel woke to find Richard standing over him with rope. Panic gave him strength. He shoved Richard back, bolted out of the barn barefoot, and sprinted into the night. He reached the road, flagged down a passing truck, and begged for help. Daniel's testimony changed everything. He told police about the farm, about Richard's strange behavior, about the attempt to tie him down. With that, detectives secured a search warrant. The raid began at dawn. Police swarmed the property, digging, probing, opening barns and sheds. Within hours, the truth surfaced. Shallow graves gave up bones, clothing fragments, wallets, watches. By the end of the first week, remains of at least 7 men were uncovered. Some matched missing persons from as far back as 3 years. Richard was arrested. In interrogation, he remained calm, almost detached. He admitted to a few deaths, claiming the men had threatened him, that he had acted in self-defense. But evidence told a different story. Drug residues in soil samples, blunt force trauma on recovered skulls, personal belongings hidden in Richard's house. It wasn't self-defense. It was murder. Systematic, repeated, intentional. At trial, prosecutors painted Richard as a predator who preyed on society's most vulnerable. The jury listened to weeks of testimony, grieving families, forensic experts, Daniel describing his escape. Photos of the dig sites flashed on the courtroom screen, shallow pits, bones tangled in roots, silent witnesses to Richard's cruelty. The verdict was swift, guilty on multiple counts of murder. The judge called Richard a farmer of death and sentenced him to life without parole. The farm was seized by the state. For years, locals avoided the land. Even after it was cleared and resold, whispers remained. People said you could feel the weight of what had happened there, as if the soil remembered. Richard believed his land made him untouchable. But land doesn't hide secrets forever. One survivor, one escape, was enough to bring everything to light. When someone offers you an easy chance at work, when the promise seems too good to be true, remember this story. Remember the farm that became a graveyard. Remember the young men who never came home. If you liked this story and don't want to miss the next episode, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support us, give this video a like. Tell me in the comments, which part of this story shocked you the most?